in a well-manicured suburb where every hedge was trimmed and every home sparkled in the afternoon sun. An unexpected twist was about to shatter one resident's self-assured world. Karen Richardson, known throughout Briarwood Estates as the strict enforcer of every HOA rule, prided herself on maintaining what she called proper order in her neighborhood. For years, she had reported every minor infraction, convinced that she was upholding the sacred traditions of the community. Today, however, her crusade would take a dramatic turn. It began on an ordinary weekday morning when Karen, scrolling through her daily list of neighborhood nuisances, noticed something that set her pulse racing with indignation. Across the street, a well-dressed black man, Darnell Carter, was casually tending to what appeared to be an area of the community pool. But Karen's eyes fixed on more than just a pool. She was convinced that Darnell was improperly occupying a space he had no right to use. In her mind, he was a disruptive element who must be removed at all costs. Without a moment's hesitation, Karen dialed 911, her voice sharp and commanding as she declared, "There's a black man using our community pool without permission. I demand immediate action." To her, this was just another instance of enforcing the rules, a mission she believed was her duty to protect the neighborhood's reputation. Within minutes, police cruisers rolled into Briarwood Estates. Neighbors peered out from behind trimmed hedges, whispering among themselves as the scene began to unfold. Darnell, unruffled and methodical in his actions, continued his work, clearly unaware of the uproar his presence had sparked in Karen's eyes. As responding officers approached, Karen's smug satisfaction quickly began to crumble. What she hadn't anticipated was the shock that would soon hit her like a tidal wave. In the ensuing conversation, one officer casually mentioned something that made Karen's heart skip a beat. Darnell Carter wasn't an intruder at all. He was the rightful owner of the very home in which Karen had been living all along. The truth, documented in digital records and confirmed by property deeds, was undeniable. Karen's call, intended to enforce her narrow vision of order, had now exposed a staggering error. She had been under the false impression that her house was hers by right, while in fact, it belonged to Darnell, whose gentle presence and responsible actions had been part of the neighborhood's fabric long before Karen's self-appointed authority had taken root. In that charged moment, as the officers relayed the truth and the gathered neighbors began to murmur in disbelief, Karen was left speechless. The power of prejudice and mistaken entitlement had collided head-on with irrefutable evidence, setting the stage for an explosive confrontation that would forever alter the balance of power in Briarwood Estates. The call she made in indignation had become the spark that would ignite a dramatic reckoning, a reckoning that would force everyone, including Karen herself, to confront the true meaning of home, ownership, and justice. Briarwood Estates was a picture-perfect suburban community, a place where every home was a testament to meticulous upkeep and every lawn a symbol of pride. Wide, tree-lined streets wound through neighborhoods that boasted uniform houses, each with its own carefully maintained garden and, for many, a sparkling pool. The residents prided themselves on order, and the Homeowners Association, HOA, enforced strict rules that governed everything from exterior paint colors to the height of garden hedges. At the center of this community stood Karen Richardson. In her early 50s, Karen was a fixture in Briarwood Estates. Always impeccably dressed in designer outfits, and with her perfectly styled hair, she saw herself as the guardian of neighborhood standards. Karen was known for her relentless vigilance. If she spotted a stray lawn ornament or an out-of-place color, she wouldn't hesitate to report it. To her, every rule was sacred, and any deviation was an affront to the community's values. Across the street lived Darnell Carter, a man whose quiet dignity and unassuming manner belied his true status. In his late 40s, Darnell had built a reputation as a man of integrity and responsibility. He had worked hard to acquire his property, a beautiful home with a state-of-the-art pool that served as his personal oasis. His days were simple, a morning swim to clear his mind, followed by meticulous care for his property. Darnell was well respected by those who knew him. His polite smile and calm presence spoke of a man who valued hard work over showy displays. The setting of Briarwood Estates was almost idyllic. Neat sidewalks, mature trees, and a strict code of conduct gave the neighborhood an air of exclusivity and order. Yet beneath this veneer of perfection, tensions simmered. The community, while outwardly united by shared standards, was also divided by subtle prejudices and the unspoken rules of old money and new arrivals. For Karen, maintaining the status quo was not just a matter of duty. It was a deeply held belief in a way of life that she thought should never be compromised. It was against this backdrop that the events of that fateful morning unfolded. Karen, convinced that she was protecting her neighborhood, had dialed 911 to report what she perceived as an unauthorized use of community facilities. Little did she know that her actions were about to upend her entire world. The revelation that Darnell Carter was not only a responsible homeowner, but also the true owner of the very house she believed was hers, was a twist that none could have foreseen. In Briarwood Estates, property records and ownership were matters of pride. For years, the HOA had maintained strict records of every homeowner, and it was widely assumed that everyone knew exactly whose home was whose. Karen's mistaken belief that she was the rightful owner of her house had been a closely guarded secret, until now. The digital records, meticulously maintained by the HOA, held the undeniable truth that Darnell Carter's name was on the deed, not Karen's. This revelation set the stage for a clash of ideologies. On one side, a woman who had dedicated herself to enforcing an outdated and narrow vision of community order. On the other, a man whose quiet strength and integrity had always been an integral part of Briarwood's fabric. The stage was set, and as the morning's events continued to unfold, every resident in Briarwood Estates began to wonder, what happens when the truth about ownership and identity is revealed in the most public of ways? The drama began to intensify as the responding officers, having verified the property records on their mobile devices, relayed the shocking news to the assembled crowd. Karen, still clutching her phone with trembling fingers, found herself at the center of a maelstrom of disbelief. Neighbors who had once admired her tenacity now exchanged uneasy glances. Murmurs spread quickly. Is it true? That house isn't hers. The digital evidence, an official printout from the HOA database, confirmed what no one had suspected. Darnell Carter was the legitimate owner of the home Karen had mistakenly believed was hers. Officer Lewis, the calm mediator in the unfolding crisis, approached Karen and attempted to explain the error. "Ma'am, according to our records, this property is registered to Mr. Carter," he said gently. But Karen, caught between anger and disbelief, struggled to accept the truth. "There must be some mistake," she insisted, her voice rising. "I've lived here for years. I know this neighborhood better than anyone." Her protests, fueled by deep-seated prejudice and a sense of entitlement, only further highlighted the gravity of her error. As the news spread, Darnell Carter emerged from his home, having heard the commotion from inside. With calm determination, he walked to the front of his property, his demeanor measured and dignified. "Understand there may have been some confusion," he said quietly to Officer Lewis, who now stood as the impartial witness to the unfolding drama. "But I assure you, all my records are in order." His voice, steady and composed, resonated with the kind of assurance that comes from years of responsibility. The situation quickly escalated as a crowd of curious onlookers gathered on the sidewalk. Some residents began to record the exchange with their smartphones, while others voiced their disbelief. "How can someone be so sure of their own property rights?" one neighbor muttered under his breath. The conflicting narratives, Karen's fervent insistence on her ownership versus the official records proving Darnell's right, created a palpable tension in the air. Local community leaders, who had long been aware of Karen's reputation for making unfounded calls to the HOA, started to speak out. At a hastily arranged neighborhood meeting that evening, residents debated the incident with increasing fervor. "This isn't just about a mistake," one longtime resident argued passionately. It's about someone using the power of the HOA to bully others based on outdated prejudices. The meeting grew heated, with some defending Karen's actions out of loyalty to tradition, while others condemned them as a blatant misuse of authority. Digital evidence became the battleground for public opinion. Social media exploded with posts and hashtags, such as hashtag #TrueHomeowner and hashtag KarenExposed, and soon the incident was being discussed on local news channels. Videos of the confrontation and the shocking revelation were remixed with commentary, each piece reinforcing the fact that Karen had been operating on a false premise. The more the evidence was shared, the clearer it became that the error was not accidental, but was instead symptomatic of a deep-seated bias that had gone unchecked for far too long. As the conflict buildup reached its peak, Officer Lewis compiled his report with meticulous detail. Every timestamp, every statement, and every digital record was logged as evidence that would later force a formal review of the HOA's procedures. His report painted an unambiguous picture: Karen's repeated misuse of the 911 system, and by extension, her misguided efforts to enforce her own narrow vision of property rights, had not only caused public embarrassment, but had also undermined the integrity of the community's trust. In the midst of the growing chaos, Karen's own frustration began to show cracks. Her initial confidence was replaced by uncertainty as neighbors and even some longtime friends expressed disappointment and dismay at her actions. "I thought we all knew the rules," she mumbled when confronted by a sympathetic neighbor. But the undeniable digital evidence, now circulating widely, left no room for argument. By the close of the day, the incident had transcended its origins as a mere administrative error. It had become a potent symbol of the dangers of unchecked prejudice, a rallying point for those who believed that true community values required honesty, accountability, and respect for individual rights. The stage was set for a dramatic escalation, one that would force the entire neighborhood of Briarwood Estates to confront its own biases and ultimately redefine the meaning of home ownership and community trust. In the days following the explosive revelation, Briarwood Estates was gripped by a storm of controversy. Social media platforms lit up with videos, photos, and heated discussions about the incident. Hashtags such as hashtag KarenExposed, hashtag #TrueOwner, and hashtag #BriarwoodJustice trended locally as residents debated how a single error in property records could have gone unnoticed for so long, and how one woman's prejudiced actions had exposed the fault lines in their supposedly perfect community. At community meetings held in the local town hall, voices once hushed by deference now rose in passionate debate. Longtime residents who had admired Karen's strict enforcement of HOA rules found themselves conflicted. "We all want order," one resident argued, "but order should never come at the expense of fairness and truth." Others, who had grown tired of Karen's repeated, unfounded calls, expressed relief that the incident had finally forced a re-examination of old practices. "This is our chance to reset our priorities," another commented, emphasizing that the community needed to evolve beyond outdated notions of entitlement. Local news outlets quickly picked up the story, featuring interviews with residents, legal experts, and civil rights advocates. A well-known local attorney commented on air, "When you allow personal bias to dictate public action, you undermine the very principles of justice." This incident is a wake-up call for all of us. His words resonated with viewers, and soon editorial boards were calling for stricter oversight of HOA practices and a complete review of property records in Briarwood Estates. Within the HOA itself, turmoil reigned. Board meetings, once conducted in an atmosphere of quiet formality, erupted into heated exchanges. Some board members defended Karen's long history of vigilant oversight, arguing that she had simply been trying to maintain standards. Others, however, insisted that her actions were a clear abuse of power, an example of how personal prejudices could warp the intentions of community governance. "Our role is to ensure fairness for everyone," one board member stated firmly during an emergency meeting, "not to let one individual impose her narrow view on the entire neighborhood." As the internal investigation deepened, digital records and historical data revealed that Karen had been involved in several similar incidents in the past, each one dismissed at the time as a minor administrative error. Now, with the incontrovertible evidence laid out before the community, it was clear that these were not isolated lapses, but part of a pattern of behavior driven by prejudice. The accumulated evidence forced even the staunchest traditionalists to confront the reality that change was necessary. Meanwhile, Officer Lewis continued to document every development, ensuring that his detailed report, replete with timestamps and eyewitness accounts, would serve as the backbone of the forthcoming disciplinary review. His commitment to transparency and accountability was met with support from many of his colleagues, who had long suspected that the system was vulnerable to misuse by those with unchecked personal biases. Protests soon broke out outside the HOA office and at the front gates of Briarwood Estates. Demonstrators, a diverse mix of residents and civil rights advocates, held signs reading "Justice for all residents" and "No to prejudice." Their chants echoed through the neighborhood, a powerful collective demand for reform that could not be ignored. Social media exploded with live streams of the protests, and local influencers weighed in on the issue, adding their voices to the chorus demanding that the community's leadership address the underlying issues. Amidst this escalating tension, a town hall meeting was scheduled by the city council to address the crisis. The meeting drew an unusually large crowd: residents, community leaders, and even some former supporters of Karen who had come to understand the broader implications of the incident. In the meeting, heated debates ensued about the proper use of public resources, the accountability of HOA board members, and the need for systemic change. "We must learn from this incident," one passionate speaker argued, "and ensure that our community never again allows personal vendettas to dictate public policy." The energy in the room was electric, a clear sign that the winds of change were beginning to sweep through Briarwood Estates. As the days passed, the digital evidence continued to serve as a rallying point. Every shared video clip and every supportive comment further eroded the credibility of Karen's long-held narrative. The community, once divided along old lines, was now united in the demand for accountability and the dismantling of outdated practices that allowed personal bias to infiltrate public life. By the end of the week, the entire neighborhood was poised on the brink of a dramatic turning point, a moment when the collective force of digital evidence, public outcry, and internal reform would force a new standard of accountability. The misuse of the 911 system, the repeated instances of discriminatory behavior, and the public's unwavering demand for justice had coalesced into a powerful movement that promised to reshape the future of Briarwood Estates. The decisive moment arrived on a cool, crisp morning in a packed boardroom at the Briarwood Community Center. The room was filled with senior city officials, representatives from the local police department, HOA board members, community leaders, and members of the media, all gathered to hear the final resolution of the internal investigation into Karen Mitchell's discriminatory actions. With a calm yet authoritative presence, Councilwoman Veronica Allen stepped up to the podium, her eyes reflecting the determination of a community united in its pursuit of justice. After an exhaustive review of all digital records, surveillance footage, and eyewitness testimonies, we have reached a conclusion that leaves no room for doubt. Councilwoman Allen began, her voice steady and clear. "It is evident that the 911 call made by Mrs. Karen Mitchell was not born out of genuine concern for public safety, but was rather an expression of deep-seated prejudice. This call represented an abuse of our emergency services, a misuse that undermines the very fabric of our community." A heavy silence fell over the room as Allen continued. "Effective immediately, Mrs. Mitchell's history of discriminatory calls will be subjected to a full disciplinary review. Moreover, we are implementing new protocols to ensure that our emergency resources are safeguarded against being exploited for personal vendettas." Her declaration was met with nods of approval and murmurs of relief from the assembled officials. At that moment, a respected community representative, a longtime advocate for civil rights, rose to speak. "Today we stand as one, united in our demand for accountability," he declared, his voice firm and resolute. Let this moment serve as a turning point where we say, no one, regardless of their past actions or personal biases, is above the law. Our public resources are for the benefit of all, and we will not allow them to be misused to further divisive agendas. His words reverberated through the room, drawing a thunderous round of applause from all present. Following this powerful declaration, a senior police official presented the final dossier, a meticulously compiled record of digital footage, internal logs, and numerous eyewitness testimonies that incontrovertibly documented Karen Mitchell's repeated misuse of the 911 system. The evidence was overwhelming. Not only was Devin Carter's routine, responsible action validated, but every instance of Mrs. Mitchell's bias was laid bare for all to see. The Internal Affairs panel unanimously supported the decision to impose strict disciplinary measures and to revise protocols governing emergency calls. Councilwoman Allen concluded her address with a final, stirring statement. Let this be the day we reclaim the integrity of Briarwood Estates. Today, we reject prejudice in every form and commit ourselves to a future where every resident is treated with fairness and respect. Our community's strength lies in our ability to hold each other accountable, and together, we will ensure that justice and truth prevail. Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, resonated deeply throughout the room and marked the definitive end of an era of unchecked bias. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom reflected a mixture of shock, resolve, and hope, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The collective call for accountability had been heard loud and clear, and the once dismissive actions of Karen Mitchell were now destined to be met with decisive, systemic reform. The turning point was clear. Prejudice would no longer be allowed to distort the use of public resources, and every act of discrimination would be confronted with the full force of community resolve. In the weeks that followed the landmark resolution, Briarwood Estates embarked on a transformative journey toward healing and reform. News of the disciplinary review against Karen Mitchell spread rapidly through local media and online platforms, igniting passionate discussions about the appropriate use of public resources and the need for accountability in every facet of community life. Community meetings and town halls were held with unprecedented attendance, as residents united to share their experiences and demand lasting change. Local newspapers published editorials with headlines such as Prejudice Exposed, A New Dawn for Briarwood, and Unity and Accountability in Our Community. Social media buzzed with supportive messages from across the region, and hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #NoMoreBias trended widely. The digital evidence from the incident, a series of videos capturing the pivotal moment when Marcus flashed his FBI badge and the subsequent fallout, became a powerful symbol of the community's refusal to tolerate discrimination. Within the Briarwood Police Department, sweeping reforms were set in motion. Senior officials, led by Director Samuel Green and Lieutenant Marcus Daniels, introduced comprehensive training programs that emphasize cultural sensitivity, ethical conduct, and a responsible use of emergency services. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary protocols were instituted, ensuring that every call for help was treated with the respect it deserved. Our duty is to serve every resident impartially, Lieutenant Daniels declared at a press conference, affirming the department's commitment to rebuilding public trust. At the same time, the HOA board, reeling from the revelations of Karen Mitchell's repeated misuse of the 911 system, took decisive steps to overhaul their processes. They initiated a full review of community records, established stricter guidelines for reporting violations, and promised greater transparency in their decision-making processes. We must evolve beyond outdated practices that have long allowed personal bias to infiltrate our community governance, stated the board president at a recent meeting, her voice resonating with the promise of change. Community leaders and civil rights organizations also played a crucial role in driving reform. They organized workshops and public forums to educate residents on the proper use of emergency services and the importance of challenging prejudice. At a well-attended town hall meeting, a passionate local activist declared, We have the power to shape our community by holding each other accountable. Today's events remind us that justice is not a privilege. It is a right that belongs to every one of us. Such messages, repeated across numerous gatherings, help to foster a renewed sense of unity and collective purpose. For Devin Carter, whose routine act of securing his pool had inadvertently sparked this movement, the ordeal had transformed him into an emblem of quiet strength and responsibility. Neighbors who had once overlooked his steady, unassuming presence now saw him as a symbol of integrity, a reminder that genuine ownership and accountability trump shallow, prejudiced assumptions. Supportive messages flooded local social media channels, and Devin was invited to speak at community events, sharing his story and inspiring others to stand up against bias. Karen Mitchell, on the other hand, faced the full force of public accountability. Isolated by overwhelming evidence of her repeated misuse of public resources, she was forced to confront the consequences of her actions. Her once firm stance crumbled in the face of undeniable proof, and even some of her longtime supporters began to distance themselves. Her case became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that personal bias, when allowed to dictate public behavior, can lead to far-reaching consequences. At a final celebratory event held in the Central Park of Briarwood Estates, residents, local officials, and law enforcement representatives gathered under the warm glow of twilight. A large banner reading, "Unity and Justice for All," hung proudly between mature oak trees as heartfelt speeches echoed the community's collective resolve. Today, we celebrate not just a victory over individual prejudice, but the promise of a future where every voice is valued and every call for help is treated with the respect it deserves, declared Councilwoman Denise Harper, her voice strong and resolute. The applause that followed was a powerful affirmation of the community's renewed commitment to fairness and unity. As Briarwood Estates slowly resumed its peaceful routine, the legacy of that fateful day endured as a beacon of transformative change. The incident, a prejudiced 911 call that was upended by the unyielding truth, had sparked a movement for accountability that resonated far beyond the boundaries of the neighborhood. Every new day in Briarwood carried the promise that public resources would be safeguarded against misuse, and that the light of truth and unity would continue to dispel the shadows of hate. In the end, the story of that summer morning was more than a tale of personal vendettas. It became a powerful reminder that when a community stands together, even the deepest-seated prejudices can be overcome. Briarwood Estates emerged stronger and more united, a place where justice and accountability were not just ideals, but the very foundations upon which a better future was built.